Companies are founded on a set of values to guide their actions. As a company evolves, is it responsible to revisit these values?
This podcast is brought to you by Archimed, fast and focused design and manufacturing.
I'm Greg Maurer, founder and owner of Archimed.
And I'm Caroline Squattrito, Talent Engagement Specialist. We are on a journey to grow, learn, and gain expertise in small to mid-size company culture. Join us.
All right, Caroline, what's the question of the day?
Well, today we are going to talk about values. So, we've discussed this in the past. We had an episode called Company Values versus Company Culture. But today we're really going to focusing on the evolution of those values. Does it ever make sense to revisit these values as a company grows and evolves? Often these values are set when the company is founded. So maybe it's worth it to revisit them from time to time. So, sharing some insight with us today will be Kevin Etzkorn. Kevin is Greg's counterpart and co owner of Archimed. We will also be speaking once again with Professor Tim Fort. Tim holds the Evely Professorship in Business Ethics and is Professor of Business Law and Ethics at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University, Bloomington.
Yeah, great topic because we don't want the values to become stale. So let's bring on my longtime business partner at Heron Capital and as you said, co-owner of Archimed, Kevin.
Okay, well, today we have the pleasure of Kevin Etzkorn joining us. Kevin is one of Archimed's owners and founders. He's been here since the beginning. Kevin, we're talking today about revisiting values, and I know that you played a big role in establishing Archimed's values. Can you go into a little bit of detail on how we established them, who was involved, when we established them, and just to get a feel for that process and what it looked like?
Sure. Thanks, Carolyn. I appreciate the opportunity. We set out to establish the mission, the vision, and the values for Archimed back in 2015. And that's, when we still had, I think, less than 50 employees. So it was fairly early on. And there we were looking at trying to establish the mission or the statement that describes who we are and why we exist, the vision, who we aspire to be in the future, and our values, which are the core principles that guide our behaviors today and into the future as we work to achieve our vision. So, we set out to establish these and ensure that everyone was on the same page and that we were all rowing in the same direction. And we thought it was important to use a collaborative process, but it really started with the executive team, which included John, Greg, and myself, and really kind of sat down and hammered out through each of those who we are, who we want to be, and how we're going to get there. And we really developed those drafts, and then in order to make it a collaborative process, we then distributed it to John's leadership team for feedback that we collected and then made some tweaks to that final draft before we distributed it more broadly. From the onset, it was really important to us that our mission, vision, and values be more than just statements. That was really important. A lot of companies will have great statements on the walls or in the employee handbook. But in order to make it real, it really requires both ownership and senior leadership to place high priority on an adherence to the values. And so it requires us to talk about and live the values on a regular basis, on a daily basis as we conduct business.
Okay, so it's been 7 years since we've developed these values. and I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether they hold true today. Like a good set of values can be foundational, or they could reflect who you were then, and maybe who you are now. It requires changes. What's your opinion?
Well, when I look at the core values, I think each of them is as relevant today as they were 6 years ago. So I don't envision that uh, they would need to change entirely or that we would need to start from scratch. But with that said, I think our organization has grown tremendously since 2015. So I think it could be valuable for us to discuss our values again as a team and consider incorporating feedback from newer members of the team, which will undoubtedly bring some great insights and possibly allow us to improve even more.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but I think it's worth a discussion. So that's Archimed's real world example. And now that we have that, let's talk to Professor Tim Fort. Okay, so Professor Tim Fort is back with us. As a reminder, Tim is a professor of business law and ethics at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. Hey, Tim, welcome back.
Great. Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
You bet.
So, Tim, we've had you on a bit. We very much welcome your knowledge. We've talked a lot about numbers in the past, and the message that we received was it's inevitable that teams evolve as companies grow, and it's pretty much impossible to remain as close knit in a 200-person company as you were in a 50-person company. It's kind of just the nature of things. But with that being said, how important are the company values that we kind of center ourselves around to fusing together those larger companies?
It's a great question, and in a lot of ways, the values are even more important as you get larger, because it does become a common ground that people can identify with, even if they cannot identify with each and every other human being with whom they're interacting. And so, to have a clear understanding of what the values are really can make a big difference. And I think that this is actually a really interesting time and opportunity with that particular issue, because I've noticed that students that I teach have been more and more concerned with finding companies where their values fit. In fact, I had my co-author for the Sincerity Edge, Countess Alexandra, was here at Kelley about 4 years ago when we were doing a joint presentation to our students, and we asked them if there's something else that we write together. What's the next thing that would be interesting to you? And that was exactly what they said. How do we find a company whose values fit? And so we wrote an article about that. And as we come out of the pandemic and see employees being really pretty choosy about where they are going to work, I think companies have a really clear set of values of who they are, becomes a very attractive thing to people that they are going to employ, and becomes a common bond within the company. Again, even if you can't have that individual interaction. So I think that they're even more important now as you get bigger, but also coming out of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think I love the idea of a common unifying. The more common and unifying aspects we can get our hands on, the better off we'll be as we grow, especially. And I think we have not only a set of values, but we also have some cultural norms that during the interview process we start to acclimate prospects to these cultural norms in order to make sure there's a good fit. But today we're talking about sort of the evolution of a set of values. So we have our original values. It's written by the three executive team members. So two owners started out with one set of values, and then we brought on another partner who's now the chief executive, and the three of us came up with the set of values that we see today. And now we have over 100 employees. I'm not sure how many we have, Caroline, but we're gonna march up that ladder. Is it feasible to have the same set of values written by the three partners now that we have approaching 125 employees?
It could be. In fact, and it depends, I think, a little bit on exactly uh, the scale of the values or the ordering of values. Let me unpack that a little bit. I mean, I have started every class that I teach, and I've taught for 35 years now, and that includes exec ed and stuff like that. So I've done this hundreds and hundreds of times that I'll start the class asking for what values or virtues that people would like to see in an organization that they work with. And then we put them all on the board, and there'll be, I mean, if you've got 60 people, there'll be 60 things on the board, but then we'll vote for the 7 things that are the most important. And remarkably, there's incredible amount of commonality around those. I mean, accountability, responsibility, creativity, loyalty. Sometimes you'll see something like fun or humor on there, open communication, honesty, integrity. Those are all, they're always there. In fact, I tell the students after it's all done that I could have come in and predicted it, but that would be no fun because then they want to have the chance to speak of what values are important to them rather than having some old professor lecture to them what they're going to be. And it's more powerful for them to see that that's what they came up with. So my guess is that if you've got 125, frankly, I think if you have 1,025, that you'll probably come up with a lot of commonality. There will be some things that are different, but I think that you'll find more commonness than what you think. So that's one level. The other thing, though, when you use the word evolution, is that, you know, talking about honesty is one thing. What honesty means in a particular situation can be very different. One example that I use is that years and years ago, I was selling my used car to my wife's 18-year-old nephew. Well, the demands of honesty there are much different, frankly, than if I'm just selling it to a used car dealer. Now, maybe they should be the same. Maybe I should treat the used car dealer exactly like I do my 18-year-old nephew. But I wanted to enjoy my Thanksgiving dinner, and I didn't want my in-laws to be mad at me because I'd taken advantage of my nephew, whereas I knew that the car dealer had their own mechanics. They can check things out. It's not all on me. And so what it means in a particular situation can be different. And similarly, and then I'll stop on this, but you know, over time, what we mean by things might differ. For instance, equality or open communication will you usually be on that list that I get. Well, actually, this is an interesting time in 2021 of exactly what that means because we have some different kind of social pressures asking us to think of what it means to be treated as equal. And so, what that means now, even though it's the same value, may have a different application or more specific meaning now than it did 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So, there will be some commonality, but there can also be some variation of what exactly these things mean.
Yeah, I think one example comes to mind is respect. And we
Great.
have that value, but it means different things to different people or different, it has a different meaning in different organizations. We also, it's not a value of ours, but culturally we like the sense of humor. And so one might say, well, that joke was disrespectful.
Yeah.
And another person would say, I think it's just funny. So I think that's a really interesting point you make.
That kind of context makes a huge difference. And just to add on one additional example of that, before I became a professor, I was a development officer at Loyola University, and my boss was a woman, a fantastic boss. In fact, in my career, I mean, of the last 33 years, I think only 3 years my director, next above supervisor, was a woman, which I think is kind of interesting. But I can tell you that because my boss, who was extremely well respected, was a woman, there was a little bit more freedom of being able to joke about things that if a male would have been in there could have been suspect because we all knew that Connie just wasn't going to let things get out of hand. I mean that, and so there were, and it gave us a permission or a freedom that she encouraged to be a little bit, to have a wider extension of what it means with evokes, where jokes where it could have been really legitimately, what did he mean by that if she wasn't there? So that cultural context can make a huge difference of how people are respected and what they think is appropriate.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing I think about as companies evolve, and it kind of gets to your point, Tim, it depends on the people a lot of times how we want to apply these values. So whether we're revisiting the values themselves or how we apply them, I do see the importance of involving more stakeholders than just, the 3-person executive team or however many person executive team. But I feel like, there's a lot of logistical problems with that. If you have a company of hundreds or thousands of people, how do you do that? Is there like a special way to, get people involved, or, at least have them make them feel like their voices are being heard and implemented? Or do you think it is best to have like that core team making these value decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're going to get different ethics professors who are going to give you different answers on that. But I'll give you my answer, and that is that I took a strong position 20, 25 years ago that when companies are doing this, that the main stakeholder group that they should consult with is their employees and their shareholders. If you get those straight, you're probably going to get everything else too, because employees are members of the community, and they interact with the suppliers and the customers. One can make an argument that customers ought to be in there too, but I mean, if you get the values of your employees and your shareholders, what I call the internal members of the organization, and you treat them well and you get their values, my guess is that things will fall into place. The environment falls into place because the employees have to breathe the air and drink the water, and it becomes a much more logistical capable. It's much more logistically capable in order to consult with with that group of stakeholders, that limited number of stakeholders. Now, again, a lot of ethicists would say no, you ought to consider everybody, and just from a psychological standpoint, I mean, I just don't know how you process all of that. So that's my heuristic of, you make sure you get your employees and your shareholders right, the rest will fall into place. So having said that, I don't think that you need to have an employee election, every year or anything like that too. In fact, I think if you had it on occasion that every 5 years or so, that maybe you asked what they think is important now, or to have breakout groups where they're telling stories of actions that they thought were exemplary in their organization, you probably are going to start to get the feedback so that maybe a smaller group could be able to redo that, having heard in some way or another from those individuals. But again, I'm hesitant about opening the door and trying to figure out what all the stakeholders want at all the time. At that point, you're running a political election, every year, and it's just I don't know how to do that. Now, there are survey instruments out there with technology that give you greater capability of doing that than it existed 10 or 20 years ago. But again, I would focus on your employees and your shareholders.
I couldn't agree more. And as I think about focusing on the employees, what is your opinion about what cross section you should make sure is represented across departments, across the org chart, leadership, weighed more heavily towards leadership or more heavily towards line workers? What do you think is the balance there?
So again, you'll have different people that will give you a different response than me, but I would cast my net widely. And the reason that I would cast my net widely is because I have confidence that when you ask people what the most important values are, you're going to get pretty much the same thing. There's going to be 4 or 5 things that are common. And I would tell them in advance even that, look, there's going to be a few things that we just can't do, but we want your input. But I'm not scared of, I do this with my students, for instance. I said, you can put down that everybody getting an A is what you want to have. I mean, that's just not going to happen. I will tell you as the leader of the class that there are some things that I can't do, but there's a lot of things that we probably can. And if you let me know what they are, my guess is that we'll have a greater consensus than what you might think. So I'm confident that if you ask everybody, that enough will fall into place. And if you tell them, and I think that if you tell them there are some things that we can't do, I think that they respect the fact that you're a leader and that they're not, and may have information that they haven't, they not. But if you give them the chance to speak, I think that those values, those common values, end up falling into place in a not scary way.
Yeah, I've seen graphics. What came to mind was those word bursts where the more often a word is said, that the bigger the print is, the font, but it captures lots of different things. I think that's right now our value statement is linear on a wall, But I'm thinking now that maybe that word burst where you see lots of different words, but the ones that are common are big and in your face. That sounds interesting to me.
I never thought of that, but that's a nice idea. I like that. Essentially, you're giving by people speaking, you're counting their votes all at the same. I should use that for my class and make it a lot easier than count up how many people said this and how many people said that. I like that
Oh,
idea.
yeah, cool. Thanks.
What I'm always thinking about is, the impact it would have on the people. So say we uproot our values, something spurs us to pivot the way that we see the company, or how we want to be, living as employees and acting. How do you roll this out to a company? If it's a big change, if people have been at this company for years living by one value set, what can we do as leaders to, not only get them on board, but help people make that transition effectively, and appreciate the new set of values that we've now come up with?
Um, I think there's a few ways you can do it. One is, and I'll repeat a couple of things earlier. I apologize, but so one, I think finding a way to solicit what they think is important every now and then. How often is every now and then? Yeah, I don't know, 5 years. I don't have a magic number on that. And there are survey instruments that I think that allow you to do that, and so you can get a sense from that fairly easily without a lot of burden. And at the same time, if it is done within the context of a perception of the employees believing that you're really interested, I think that that is a reinforcing tool. Um, I am the other thing. Second thing I would do is I am a huge fan of this, and I've done this in consulting gigs over the years. Um, that to give people the opportunity to tell their stories of what they think a good action was at work, which is much harder to do than to point out the thing that really made them mad. We can all think of a bunch of things that made them make us mad, but to point out something that we're proud of or that we saw that inspired them, puts them, gives them a chance to essentially articulate what their values are because they are inspired by that. But it also opens up the communication within the organization of how to talk about these things. And that again is another way or another step. And you can do that in small groups. We've talked about magic numbers here before in our conversation. 4 to 6, 31, 50. If you break people into, you do retreats all the time. As part of your retreat, to have a group of 30, share their stories, or a group of 4 to 6 share their stories, and just to be able to talk about them makes ethics part of what their work life is about. And that reinforces the message that we're interested in this. We think this is important. And then when you give that survey every 5 years, then you're reinforcing that kind of a message. And then, when Alexander and I did that book, The Sincerity Edge, we asked 20 CEOs from Europe and the US of what the factors were that were that they thought were important in building an ethical culture. And without any question, the number one answer was tone at the top. I mean, people are going to need to hear from the top that this is important. They're going to need to believe that it's important, that you're willing to put your money where your mouth is, even if it may cost you money, that you're going to, when rubber hits the road, that you're going to believe in your values. And the way that you approach the employees, the leadership approach the employees of being respectful and interested and stuff like those all send really strong messages. And so when you're rolling something out or when you're changing things, I think engaging all of those, giving people something to say, opportunity to speak on the values, tell their own stories, and to be the witness of that this is something that is being really taken seriously by the people at the top of the organization. I think it's a multiple kind of a sequence that you can use in order to solidify that message.
Yeah, that's helpful. I've always liked the idea of having folks share stories of how values were lived, but never quite understood exactly when that would happen. But you brought up the leadership retreats, and that makes perfect sense. And you earlier you mentioned about societal change. I'd like to come back to that a little bit. So if our company values, let's say, they were put together 10 years ago, and now we are in just a different. It feels like we're in a very different world than we were 10 years ago. And so, how do we look at our values that are maybe are working operationally, but maybe no longer lining up with society in the right way or the way we've intended?
Yeah, that is a great challenge, because I mean there are times when you think society has lost its head, and that you want to stake out a position that you think is a morally solid position, um, in contradiction to what society says, or maybe you think that society has the right idea and people in your organization are slow to catch up with it. So it can happen in any. There's always this pull, back and forth. What philosophers like to call a dialectical tension between these kinds of things of a going back and forth. And I don't have a clear answer of how you do that, except that you just have to embrace the challenge, to be talking with people, to be getting feedback, people to be willing to be willing even to take a stand when people disagree. People can tolerate more disagreement than I think that we give them credit for, as long as you're respectful in telling them why you're doing something. I mean, one of my favorite stories on that is, if you're a devotee of musical theater or political history, either one of those, is when in the musical Hamilton, where Jefferson and Aaron Burr are contending for the presidency, and it's deadlocked. They're both in the Democratic Republican Party. And so they're starting to turn to the Federalist Party in order to break the tie in Congress of who's going to get elected. And Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson have been at each other's throats during the entire George Washington presidency, opposing each other on everything. But when it comes time to choose between the two, Burr, Jefferson, Hamilton says he chooses Jefferson. Why? Jefferson has beliefs. Burr has none. I mean, the fact that you have beliefs is something that people can respect. When I've done that storytelling exercise with companies on consulting gigs, many times they were at each other's throats, but giving the opportunity to hear each other of why they thought something was important allowed them to be able to respect the person and embrace them even when they still disagreed. And so I think that there's actually an ability for us to disagree with each other, as long as we're respectful of doing it and people understand why and why it's important. And I think that's true in this societal challenge that you talk about, Greg, that we're always going to be in a bit of flux of what appropriate values are, what our values are. Are our values still the same values now? Should they change? And I think as long as there is respectful communication among the people and that you find common ground to be able to have that kind of a dialogue, I think that people can even accept the disagreement. But there's no clear answer of exactly how it lines up perfectly. I wish there were, but I just don't think that there is. It's
Right.
always a lot of work.
I remember in an earlier episode where you joined us and spoke about the family business that you helped.
That's the one.
Yeah, I love that story, because I can just picture that, and how much value you gave to so many people by allowing them to get along or disagree respectfully. I have a question related to the societal stuff. Over the last year, you've seen many CEOs who are taking their values and not just worrying about how they're espoused within the organization, but taking political stances and getting involved, with policy that's really broader than their company. And some people say, well, that's great, and some people say, why, stay in your lane. You have an opinion on whether CEOs should take public positions on politics and stuff like that?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One, there was a great back and forth dialogue in the Wall Street Journal after what I would designate as the Charlottesville, Virginia catastrophe. I'll put just my view out there on what happened there. And after that happened, many CEOs spoke out, including on immigration issues, on race-related issues, and things like that. And there was a couple of scholars, one from the Duke School of Business, Fuqua School of Business, and another fellow from one of the Washington think tanks, and I don't remember which one, which basically said, stay in your lane. I mean, remember, your job is, as the CEO, to maximize shareholder profitability. It's not to speak out on all these various issues. And if you want to have reinforcement of that, look at the famous 1919 case, Dodge versus Ford. This is the law. The next day, a law professor out at UCLA, Stephen Brainbridge, wrote in response, that was probably the stupidest article that I've ever seen in the Wall Street Journal, because they clearly are not familiar with the Wrigley versus Shilensky case. Interesting to me, I teach those two cases every year, Dodge versus Ford and Wrigley versus Shilensky. And the Wrigley case is the Chicago Cubs, of the shareholders that were suing the Chicago Cubs because at that time they only played day baseball games. And the shareholder wanted to play night baseball games because he thought that they would make more money. And the Wrigley said, well, but we're interested in something else. We're interested in building a brand, but build a brand that's sensitive to what the community needs. Do we really want to? I mean, Wrigleyville was not the yuppie-fied area that it is now. It had a lot of crime. And do we want to let a bunch of fans who've been drinking beer for the last 3 hours into the community? And is it safe for our fans to go into a community at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night when there's a lot of crime? And so we want to take into account a wider range of stakeholders other than just what's going to make the Cubs the most money. And the court upheld it too. Those are both shareholder theories, but they're different versions of shareholder theory. And so executives have a choice of what one they want to follow. You can take a narrower view, and it's legal to do. You can take a broader view, and it's legal to do, as long as you can tie it to some sort of a brand. So I'm not too hung up on duty per se of whether they should do it or not. I think it's an opportunity to do it. And I think it's a nice opportunity to take. And I like to see CEOs being willing to take a stand, because I think that they are leaders in our society. I don't think that they have a duty to do that, but I do admire them if they take that stance, because I think that's a contribution to the public debate.
Yeah, that's a helpful way to put it. Whether there's a duty and or not, I agree. There isn't a duty. Shouldn't be a duty.
Yeah, I'm not a lot of ethics professors are duty professors. I mean, it comes out of Immanuel Kant, and that we must, we are obligated. And I'm not. I'm more of what's called a virtue theorist. That I like to see what's possible, what's exemplary, what's admirable, but I don't necessarily think because you didn't do the thing that was absolutely exemplary doesn't mean you failed your duty. I mean, I applaud what you did, but if you didn't do it, that doesn't mean that I've decided that you have failed a duty. Those are different ways of looking at ethics, and I fall more on unless there's a law, a specific law, where then you can say that you have failed a duty that you had. I much more tends to be the virtue exemplary. That was a good thing that you did, and leave it at that.
Yeah, I think that gives us a lot to think about, and it sheds some good light. And like you said, it gives us, multiple ways of looking at a situation, and it doesn't have to be just good or bad. There is that's just praise for doing something, and it doesn't mean that you're a failure if you didn't. So I'm curious your thoughts on the argument against, evolving your values. So, I think there's something to be said for a company's founded on a set of values, unless there's something, blatantly offensive about those values, and there's something along the lines of like respect, communication, et cetera. And is it potentially beneficial to just hold true to those? And is it almost like that binding of culture together? And it's like this is our culture and we're sticking to it.
Two responses on that. One is um, I tend to lean towards sticking to the values, recognizing that there can be some learning of what those values might mean in a certain type of place. One reason for that is that those overarching values, those ones that keep getting elected when I do that exercise, I think those are hard values to run away from. You really want to run away from accountability and open communication and loyalty and creativity. I mean, those are pretty good values, and I think that those are perpetual values. And so I'm worried if people want to just overthrow the values that they come into because they're part of our identity. Again, recognizing that it's still hard work to modify them as times change, so that you might have a truer sense of what those values mean. It may well be that the modification of the values give you a deeper understanding of values. I think that that's important too. So that's one response. I mean, I lean toward sticking to your values, but being open to how to make them richer, put it that way. The other, and I may be ranging into territory that we don't want to range into in spirituality kinds of issues, and this just happened to me last week, but one of my summer activities was I thought I would try my hand at doing audiobooks, to narrate audiobooks. And I ended up landing an agreement to narrate a book written by the Dalai Lama. And I was reading that book in the studio last week, and it was very interesting to hear what he had to say on spiritual things. He said, some people, he's a Tibetan Buddhist, want to jettison whatever religion that they came up with and embrace this. He said, I'd be cautious about that. This is the Tibetan Buddhist talking about his own. I'd be cautious about this because those values that you came up with are part of who you are. And while there may be some helpful things from my tradition that help you, if you just get rid of all of those, you may find yourself in a very confused state of who you are. I thought that was really an interesting way of thinking about it, or putting it, that maybe I can help you by offering you other values that help you make your life richer and your own values richer. But be cautious of throwing away who you are, because there's a cost in doing that. I just thought that was a really interesting kind of way to think about it that's applicable to your question.
That's really neat. I can appreciate that. I don't know whether Buddhism is an evangelical religion or not. Maybe it's not, so that's part of it. And also, I'm exposing my lack of knowledge on Buddhism right now, but it also might not be rooted in beliefs the way other religions are rooted in beliefs. You are this religion, but you must believe these things, rather than if you are this religion, you must do these things, right? You must live these values through actions and behaviors. That's fascinating.
All I have to say is this gives you good reason to buy the audiobook that I'm
There
narrating.
you go. Yeah. Right. I value your patience, to read aloud. I have 3 kids, and the thing I hate the most is reading aloud. I don't know why that is, but I can't wait for me to finish the chapter. And they say, one more chapter. I'm like, you got to ask your mom. I can't do another chapter. So
it's hard. It really is. It's amazing how quickly you get tongue-tied.
Yeah.
That you think you're just reading, but and then you have to start all over again. And it's exhausting to do it, but it's been kind of fun.
Cool. Well, hey, thanks for coming on today and telling us a little bit about the evolution of values and how to think about it. You've given us a lot to chew on, but the one thing that's sitting really well with me is that the right values are perpetual values, and they're hard to run away from. So I like that. It's helping me frame how we would look at this. So Tim, thanks as always for coming on the show today. We loved having you.
Thanks. Glad to be here and look forward to future interactions.
So that was, as always, some great insight from Professor Tim Fort. I just love talking to that guy. So Caroline, what did we learn today?
Well, we touched on some things that we already have discussed, like, values really are that bond that holds a company together. And that's really important when we talk about revisiting these values, because with them being such a foundational aspect of a company and a glue, especially for bigger companies, these are things we need to think about before we just go shaking up all of a company's core values.
Yeah, on one hand. On the other hand, it might make sense to revisit them every so often, even if no changes are made. And we may not delete, but we may add.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that Tim talked about a lot as well was, maybe it's not changing the value itself, but how we look at the value and how we represent the value in our actions. One example that I like to think about is, think about the value of respect. Not that long ago, that meant, showing up business professional, staying true to an organization's hierarchy, respecting, well, taking your boss's opinion as Bible maybe. And now I think we're leaning more towards, respect, meaning bringing your whole self to work and people respecting that, and, everyone having a voice in decisions, and, being able to joke around with people. So I think that's a natural evolution of things. but it doesn't mean we have to throw respect out the window.
Yeah, I agree with that. As Tim said, the right values are hard to run away from, and the right values are perpetual values, part of who you are, part of your identity. But we might discuss the meaning behind them. We might discuss whether we all agree on what the meaning is behind each word in our value statement. I think that's something interesting to do, as a leadership team. Um, Maybe even ask folks to tell a story about how the values were lived in real life, maybe inside work, maybe outside of work. I think that's an interesting way to revisit the values, not necessarily the content, but make sure that the new folks are aligned on the meaning and how it should show up in the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think storytelling is so powerful in that way, and it's a great way to get people engaged. And I liked when Tim talked about, a classroom example, and this speaks to those perpetual values. He asked his students to, each come up with values that they want to see in companies. And he says, often you end up with a very similar set of like 5 to 8 values on the board that everyone can kind of get behind. And those are the things where, maybe communication, respect, things like that change how we, use them to walk the walk. But we don't we like things like creativity and communication. We like to have these things in a business, and it's important to recognize that and stay true to that.
Yeah, for sure. I like the question you asked about society, changing society, and perpetual values, essentially. And if one changes and the other doesn't, you may find yourself in contradiction to society. And Tim's response, well, that is a challenge. It's not easy to figure that out. And as I was reflecting on that, I think that we engage in a thoughtful process to produce values that are important to us, that we want to have guide our employees and how we interact with each other, with customers, with vendors, etc. And sometimes we'll line up with society, and sometimes we'll contradict society. And I don't really give a damn. Society will be where it is, and we have our true north, and we'll be where we are. And sometimes we'll line up, and sometimes we won't. That's where I'm at.
Well, and I think with that, if we are, as you say, engaging all of these people in a discussion around values, I mean, you're going to come out with a set of values that reflects who we really are, and I think that's kind of the point. Um, and Tim mentioned there can just be a lot of data to asking everyone in an organization how they feel about values or to reflect on their values, and that can be hard to just comprehend, especially if you're a company with thousands and thousands of employees.
Yeah.
And I liked his suggestion to, you can do something like take focus groups from people from all over the company, try to get a good representation there. And then that's again where that storytelling can come into play, and see what people really hold as important, and then use that to help shape your values.
Yeah. And he, as always, gave us a couple really great concrete pieces of advice. One, tone at the top. That shows what's important. As you always say, Caroline, walk the walk. And two, the second one I really liked was that people, employees, can tolerate disagreement when they're in the presence of respect and true beliefs. And I thought there's a lot packed into that statement, because we want to have disagreement, we want to have dissent, we don't want to have everyone conform, and we want people to bring dissenting opinions to the conversation, but do it with respect. And if we live our values, if they're truly our belief on how to behave, then that disagreement will be tolerated by everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really says it all. And I mean, I always feel like we walk away with a lot of insight when we talk to Tim. So I'm definitely glad that we were able to talk to him about this. And yeah, I mean, it might be time for us to maybe talk to some people about how they live our values, and, make sure we're reflecting things in the right way.
Absolutely. This was a good episode.
our next episode, we are doing something a little bit special. It will be our very first book review. We will be discussing the book Multipliers, written by Liz Wiseman. Joining us will be Archimed CEO John DeSalvo, and we will also be joined by Jim Buchanan to talk about his firsthand experience with Greg and his leadership journey.
Yeah, can't wait.